The church bells had fallen silent 3 months before Lily Granger's voice followed them into ash and memory. She pressed her fingers against her throat as the stagecoach wheels carved another mile through Texas dust, feeling the scar tissue that mapped her shame like a brand. Once, her soprano had lifted congregations toward heaven. Now even a whisper felt like blasphemy against the God who had let flames devour everything she'd ever loved. The other passengers avoided her eyes, sensing something broken in the way she held her silence like a shield. When the Comanche war cries split the desert air and arrows began to sing their own deadly songs, Lily almost welcomed the violence. Perhaps this was how cursed voices finally found their rest. But as the warrior's painted face appeared at the stagecoach window, something in his dark eyes suggested that her story of silence had only just begun. Subscribe to discover how a broken song might still save 2 wounded souls. The morning sun painted the Texas hill country in shades of copper and gold, but Lily Granger saw only the dust that coated everything like a shroud. She sat rigid in the corner of the stagecoach, her gloved hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white through the worn leather. The other passengers, a cattle rancher heading to San Antonio and a drummer selling patent medicines, had given up trying to draw her into conversation hours ago. They couldn't know that every word they spoke felt like a knife against the silence she'd wrapped around herself like armor. The rancher's wife hummed a hymn under her breath, something about amazing grace, and Lily's throat constricted as if invisible hands were squeezing the life from her windpipe. She turned her face toward the window, watching the endless expanse of mesquite and prickly pear blur past, each mile taking her further from the charred remains of everything she'd once believed sacred. The scar tissue along her neck pulled tight when she swallowed, a constant reminder of the night the church had burned. She could still smell the smoke in her dreams, still hear the screams of the congregation trapped behind doors that wouldn't open, still feel the heat that had seared her throat as she'd tried to sing them to safety. But her voice had failed when they needed it most. The gift that had once lifted hearts to heaven had cracked and shattered like glass in a furnace. The doctors in Austin had told her she was lucky to be alive, that her vocal cords might heal with time, but Lily knew better. God had taken her voice as punishment for her pride, for believing that her gift made her special, for thinking that beautiful songs could somehow hold back the darkness that lived in men's hearts. Now she carried that darkness inside her own chest, a weight that made every breath feel stolen. The stagecoach lurched over a particularly deep rut, and the drummer's sample case rattled against the floor. He was a thin man with nervous eyes who'd been stealing glances at her since they'd left the last way station, probably wondering why a young woman traveled alone through country where Comanche raids had been growing bolder each month. Lily had heard the whispered warnings at every stop. Whole families found scalped and mutilated, their homesteads burned to ash, their livestock scattered to the 4 winds. But she felt no fear of death, only a hollow curiosity about whether dying might finally silence the phantom songs that still echoed in her damaged throat. Sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, she could almost hear her voice as it used to be, pure and strong and full of faith. Then consciousness would return like a slap, and she'd remember that the girl who could sing angels down from heaven was as dead as everyone who'd perished in that fire. The rancher was telling his wife about the new preacher they'd hired for their town, how the man had a voice that could shake the very foundations of hell itself. His wife nodded and smiled, her weathered hands working at a piece of embroidery that depicted a cross surrounded by roses. Lily watched those careful stitches and remembered her own mother's hands, how they'd moved with the same patient devotion as she'd sewn choir robes by lamplight. Mother had always said that Lily's voice was a gift from God, meant to bring comfort to the suffering and hope to the lost. But what kind of God gave such gifts only to snatch them away when they were needed most? What kind of divine love let innocent people burn, while the one person who might have saved them stood frozen in the doorway, her throat closing like a fist around words that would never come? The embroidered roses seemed to mock her with their perfect beauty, their threads unburned and unbroken. As the afternoon wore on, the landscape grew more desolate, the scattered homesteads giving way to empty miles of sage and stone. The driver had been pushing the horses hard since the last station, eager to reach the next settlement before dark. Everyone knew that Comanche war parties preferred to strike at dawn or dusk, when the light played tricks on a man's eyes and shadows could hide a dozen painted warriors. The rancher checked his rifle for the third time in an hour, while his wife clutched her Bible with white knuckles. Even the drummer had stopped his nervous chatter, his patent medicines forgotten as he peered out at the gathering twilight. But Lily felt only a strange calm settling over her like dust. If death came riding out of the desert on painted ponies, perhaps it would be a mercy, a final silence to match the one that had already claimed her soul. The first arrow struck the lead horse without warning, sending the animal screaming to its knees in a tangle of harness and blood. The stagecoach tilted wildly as the driver fought to control the remaining horses, his curses lost in the thunder of hoofbeats that seemed to come from every direction at once. Through the window, Lily caught glimpses of painted faces and feathered lances, of horses that moved like liquid shadow across the broken ground. The rancher's wife was praying now, her voice high and desperate as she clutched her embroidery to her chest like a shield. The drummer had gone pale as milk, his hands shaking as he fumbled for a pistol that looked like it had never been fired. But Lily sat perfectly still in her corner, watching death approach with the same detached interest she might have shown a distant thunderstorm. Perhaps this was how her story was meant to end, not with song, but with the silence she'd learned to carry like a stone in her chest. The stagecoach shuddered to a halt in a cloud of dust and dying screams, the wounded horses' cries cutting through the desert air like a blade through silk. Lily pressed herself against the wooden seat as painted warriors circled their disabled prey, their ponies dancing with barely controlled energy. The rancher fired once, twice, his shots echoing off the canyon walls before a lance took him in the shoulder and sent him sprawling across his wife's lap. She was still praying, her voice now a broken whisper that seemed to dissolve in the heat like morning dew. The drummer had dropped his useless pistol and was weeping openly, his patent medicine scattered across the floor in a rainbow of broken glass and false promises. Through it all, Lily watched with the strange clarity that comes to those who have already died inside, her damaged throat working soundlessly around words that would never find voice. The warrior who appeared at her window moved with the fluid grace of water over stone, his face painted in stripes of red and black that made his dark eyes seem to burn with inner fire. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps near her own age, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of his people's ancient sorrows. When their gazes met through the dusty glass, something passed between them that had nothing to do with the violence surrounding them, a recognition that went deeper than language or blood. He spoke a single word in his own tongue, soft as a prayer, and gestured for her to step down from the coach. The rancher's wife grabbed at Lily's skirt with desperate fingers, but Lily gently pulled free and moved toward the door with the same calm acceptance she'd carried since the night her voice had died in flames. The warrior's name, she would learn later, was Nakar, a word that meant the one who sees clearly in the language of his people. He helped her down from the stagecoach with surprising gentleness, his calloused hands steady against her trembling ones. Around them, the other warriors were gathering the horses and whatever supplies they could carry, their movements efficient and purposeful. The rancher and his wife huddled together in the dust, alive but broken, while the drummer continued his pitiful weeping. But Nokar's attention remained fixed on Lily, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. She tried to speak, to ask what would become of her, but only a harsh whisper emerged from her damaged throat. Something flickered in his expression then. Not pity, but a kind of understanding that cut through her defenses like a knife through paper. He led her to his horse, a magnificent paint stallion that stood 17 hands high and bore the scars of many battles. With movements that spoke of long practice, Naukar lifted her onto the animal's back and swung up behind her, his arms forming a protective circle around her waist. The other warriors were already mounting, their captives, if any survived, forgotten in the growing darkness. As they rode away from the broken stagecoach, Lily caught one last glimpse of the rancher's wife still clutching her embroidered cross, her lips moving in silent prayer. The sight sent a familiar stab of pain through Lily's chest, a reminder of all the prayers that had gone unanswered on the night her world had burned. But Naukar's presence at her back was solid and warm, and for the first time in months she felt something other than the cold weight of her own shame. They rode through the night across country that seemed carved from moonlight and shadow, following paths that only the Comanche knew. Naukar never spoke, but his silence was different from her own, not the heavy quiet of grief and guilt, but the comfortable stillness of a man who understood that some truths could only be communicated without words. His horse moved beneath them with the rhythm of breathing, carrying them deeper into a landscape that felt both alien and strangely familiar. The stars overhead seemed brighter here, away from the settlements and their smoky fires, and Lily found herself remembering nights when she'd stood in the church garden and sung to those same distant lights. Her throat ached with the memory of melodies that would never again find voice, but somehow the pain felt different now, less like punishment and more like mourning for something precious that had been lost. As dawn approached, they crested a ridge and looked down into a valley where a river wound between cottonwoods and willows, like a silver thread through green silk. The Comanche camp spread along the water's edge, a collection of hide lodges that seemed to grow from the earth itself. Smoke rose from cooking fires in thin grey columns, and children's laughter carried on the morning breeze like music. Lily felt Naukar's body tense behind her as they descended toward his people, and she wondered what kind of reception awaited a white woman who had lost her voice to fire and her faith to ashes. But as they rode into the camp, she noticed something that made her breath catch in her damaged throat. An old woman sitting by the largest lodge, her fingers moving across a drum in patterns that seemed to echo the rhythm of her own broken heart. The sound was haunting and beautiful, a song without words that spoke of loss and longing and the possibility of healing. For the first time since the fire, Lily felt tears on her cheeks, and she didn't try to wipe them away. The sacred river ran silver beneath the moon, its waters whispering secrets that only the wind understood. Lily sat at its edge, her bare feet touching the cool current, while Naukar remained a respectful distance behind her, his presence both protective and patient. The night air carried the scent of sage and cedar, mingling with the distant smoke from the campfires that dotted the hillside like fallen stars. She had not spoken since her voice had broken free the night before, but something had shifted between them, a bridge built from shared silence and mutual recognition of pain. The water moved past her feet with gentle insistence, and she found herself thinking of the baptisms she had witnessed as a child, the way the preacher would lower believers into the creek behind the church, their faces radiant with faith and hope. Now the water seemed to be asking something of her, demanding a different kind of surrender. Naukar's footsteps were soft on the grass as he approached, settling beside her with the fluid grace of a man who belonged to this land as surely as the cottonwoods belonged to the riverbank. "My grandmother," he said quietly, his English careful and deliberate, "she say the river remember all songs ever sung to it." His dark eyes reflected the moonlight as he gazed across the water, and Lily felt the weight of generations in his words. "She say when voice is lost, river keep it safe, until heart ready to take it back." The simplicity of his statement cut through her like a blade, exposing the raw wound she had been protecting for so long. Lily's hands trembled as she drew them from the water, droplets falling like tears back into the current. "I killed them," she whispered, the words barely audible above the river's murmur. "My voice. It called them to the church that night. If I hadn't been singing, they wouldn't have come. The fire wouldn't have—" Her voice broke again, but this time it felt different, less like shattering and more like the first crack in a dam that had held back too much for too long. Naukar turned to face her fully, his weathered features soft with understanding. "Fire choose its own path," he said, reaching out to touch her hand with surprising gentleness. "Voice not make fire, voice make beauty, fire make destruction. They not same thing." His fingers were warm against her cold skin, and she felt something inside her chest begin to loosen, like a knot that had been tied too tight for too long. The river continued its eternal song, and as Lily listened, she began to hear something else beneath its surface, the echo of every hymn she had ever sung, every note that had risen from her heart to touch the divine. They were still there, waiting in the water's memory, patient as the stones that lined the riverbed. For the first time since the fire, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps her voice had not been a curse after all, but a gift that had simply been waiting for the right moment to return. Dawn broke over the camp like a prayer answered, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded Lily of the stained glass windows that had once graced her father's church. Naukar moved through the morning light with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to solitude, tending to his horse and checking his weapons with practiced hands. But Lily had begun to notice the small signs of pain he tried to hide, the way he favored his left side when he thought no one was watching, the careful way he breathed when he lifted anything heavy. She found him by the horse corral, running his hands along his stallion's flanks with the tenderness of a man who understood that some bonds transcended words. The horse was magnificent, black as midnight, with eyes that held the same depth of wisdom she had come to recognize in his master. When Naukar turned and saw her approaching, something flickered across his features. Surprise, perhaps, or the kind of wariness that came from a lifetime of expecting disappointment. "You carry pain too," she said softly, stopping just close enough that he could hear her without feeling trapped. The observation hung between them like morning mist, delicate and revealing. His hand stilled on the horse's neck, and for a moment she thought he might deny it, might retreat behind the wall of stoic silence that seemed to be his natural defense. Instead, he lifted his shirt slightly, revealing a scar that ran from his ribs to his hip, a twisted line of pale flesh that spoke of violence and survival. "Cavalry saber," he said simply, his voice carrying no self-pity, only the matter-of-fact tone of a man stating the weather. "3 winters past. They come for our horses, our children. I stopped them, but—" He let the shirt fall back into place, but the image remained burned in Lily's mind. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. She had seen that look before, in the mirror after the fire, the expression of someone who had survived when others had not, who carried the weight of that survival like a stone in their chest. "Does it still hurt?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from the careful way he moved, the slight hitch in his breathing when he thought no one was listening. "Pain remind me I still alive," he replied, but there was something in his eyes that suggested the reminder was not always welcome. "Sometimes I think it easier to die with them, with my brother who fall beside me. But grandmother say I have purpose still, something I must do before I join ancestors." His gaze found hers, and she saw in it the same desperate hope she had been trying to deny in herself, the possibility that their meeting was not accident, but design. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the camp, and Lily felt the weight of recognition settle over her like a blanket. They were both wounded, both carrying scars that went deeper than flesh, both searching for a reason to believe that their survival meant something more than mere chance. In the distance, she could hear the river singing its eternal song, and for the first time since the fire, she wondered if perhaps some voices were meant to harmonize. The ruins of the old mission stood like broken teeth against the evening sky, its adobe walls crumbling back into the earth from which they had risen. Narkau had brought her here without explanation, leading his horse through the mesquite and prickly pear until they reached this forgotten place where Spanish priests had once tried to plant their foreign god in native soil. Lily stood among the scattered stones and felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the reflexive fear that had become her constant companion whenever she encountered anything that reminded her of churches and faith, and the terrible night when everything had burned. But this place was different somehow, older and more honest in its decay. There was no pretense here, no gleaming pews or polished brass, just the honest acknowledgement that all things built by human hands eventually returned to dust. Narkau moved through the ruins with reverence, touching the walls with the same gentle care he showed his horse, and Lily realized that this place held meaning for him too, though perhaps of a different kind. "My people come here sometimes," he said, settling on a fallen beam that had once supported the mission's roof. "Not to pray to Spanish God, but to remember that all empires fall, all walls crumble, even pain." His words carried the weight of prophecy, and Lily felt something shift inside her chest, like a door that had been locked for too long finally beginning to open. The wind moved through the ruins with a sound like distant singing, and Lily found herself walking toward what had once been the altar, her feet moving without conscious direction. The stones beneath her feet were worn smooth by time and weather, and she could almost hear the echoes of all the voices that had once filled this space. Spanish hymns and native chants, prayers in languages she didn't recognize but somehow understood. "I used to believe," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I used to think my voice was God's gift, that every note was a prayer made manifest. But when the fire came..." She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, but Narkau's presence behind her was steady and patient, waiting for her to find her way to the truth. The sun was setting now, painting the ruins in shades of amber and gold, and Lily felt something rising in her chest, a pressure that had been building since that first night by the river. Without conscious thought, she opened her mouth and let the sound emerge. Not words, not even a melody, but something deeper and more primal, a keening that spoke of loss and longing and the terrible beauty of survival. The sound echoed off the broken walls and seemed to lift toward the darkening sky, carrying with it all the grief she had been holding inside. And as her voice soared into the evening air, she felt Narkau's hand touch her shoulder, grounding her, reminding her that she was not alone in this moment of terrible, beautiful release.